Good evening. I'm Martin Krieger, and I've been MC of the event so far and tomorrow, but I don't have much of a role here tonight. The only reason I'm talking, or at least as I understand it, is to induce shame, guilt, remorse in you, those of you who weren't for the other sessions, because and just came for the show. What you'll see tonight is, on the one hand, a very distinctive performance, but one integrally related to what we've been talking about in the last day and a half and tomorrow. And here is Anna Howard, who will introduce the performers in a moment, but back to shame and guilt. The Talking Justice program, as I understand it, was invented, an invention of Peter Noble here, who is the head of Arc Justice, and my understanding is that he had the idea, it sounds very vague because my understanding is very vague. My understanding is that he had the idea some time ago that a community legal centre shouldn't just be like a kind of plumber, no offence, providing services for people with legal needs, but rather be also a centre where people who are involved in, or maybe more generally interested in, issues of justice learn or get an opportunity to discuss with people who've thought about these things. What are the central issues that might exist? What are the stakes? What are the challenges? And if we're lucky, we're not always lucky, what are the potential solutions to some of these fraught problems? And he started the program 2 years ago, and this is the third, and he asked me to be the MC. I've never been an MC before, and I don't think I will be again, but he asked me to be the MC, and when he picked me up from the airport, I asked him, look, what are we doing here? And he was a bit diffident, I thought, shy, certainly didn't tell me much, and I didn't know what he had in mind quite, and I didn't know what he had in mind for me, but I was amazed by the event. There were serious people who had come to listen, there were serious people who had come to talk, and a conversation developed about fundamental issues, and that's been the case in the last day and a half too. And for those of you who are afflicted, unable to come, caught by floods, fires, let me just tell you very briefly, we've had 4 sessions, and we have one tomorrow. Last night we started with, rather portentously named, Justice in an Era of Global Dislocation. But that is the era in which we are. So we had experts, Julian Burnside, Paris Aristotle, focusing on issues of refugees, which is certainly not only an Australian problem, but a worldwide problem of horrific and huge dimensions. We also had Felicity, Gary, who told us a great deal about matters of human trafficking and other associated pathologies associated with that. This morning we talked about crime, getting smart. We asked whether we're getting smarter on crime, and your Victorian Ombudsman talked about prisons. Justice Judy Small talked about power and advocacy. Julian McMahon, who had been the barrister for many people in desperate straits, talked about the problems that he and that more particularly they face. The next session had to do with gender and diversity. After that, more recently, the last session before this, celebrating and safeguarding cultural identity, which was a painful session because the sorts of problems that our Aboriginal representatives talked about were so deep and so hard to address that one theme that has come through all the discussions is the extent to which these are problems which are not solved because people aren't willing to solve them or aren't willing to devote the resources to solve them, or whether there's some deeper sense in which they are what is now called, and we've used this word a number of times through the sessions, wicked problems, problems which are intrinsically, they defy or seem to defy solution. That's a constant looming horror or worry that people involved in dealing with serious problems have to face, and one that we talked about today. And tomorrow, Tim Costello and wait for it, Sukhjit Kaur are going to focus on equality in an unequal world. Now, that's been very stimulating, but there's been a lot of prose, has to be said, a lot of prose. We had one fleeting hope that Justice Judy Small, who had an illustrious 16-year career as a folk singer, would break out of the judicial mould and just get back to it. But there was no, she was too dignified for that, so he didn't. And tonight we're going to have a performance, but that's a different genre, but not a different focus and not a different range of problems. Judy Small mentioned, and it was interesting to hear it because I'd not heard it, but as soon as she said it, it sounded true, that there had never been a movement for change which hadn't been accompanied by music, by song. If it's true, I'm prepared to believe it's true, and it sounds good. If it's true, it's an important truth. And art, again and again, gives us deeper insights. I'm a so-called social scientist, and what do we learn from social science? Zip on a lot of the important matters. But on some of the greatest matters of justice, of ethics, of respect for persons, where you go looking is in art of one form or another. If you think about crime and punishment, you go to Dostoevsky, you don't go to a criminologist, God forbid. And that's true in a lot of arts. And I'll leave you with this one because this looks like an affluent community. I'm sure you go on holidays. If you do go on holidays, please go to Siena in Italy. And if you do go to Siena, which is a pretty town for many reasons, go to their town hall. In the town hall, you'll see what is one of the first artistic reflections on some of the deepest matters of political philosophy. In the town hall of Siena, 3 walls are frescoes devoted to good and bad government. On one wall there is, and you can look it up on Google, it's almost as good. One wall, it's the effects of good government in the city and the country. On the opposite wall, it's the effects of bad government. And there is so much, I can't portray it for you, but it's this is something I should only tell my therapist, but I cried when I watched it because there is so much in these 2 paintings, and on the front wall is what he's called the allegory of good government or the virtues of good government. All of this is portrayed without words. Now what we're going to hear in a moment is words, but not words of the sort that an academic will drone out, but done in a more appealing, affecting, and often a more moving way. And I'll move now. Oh, sorry, one more thing. It is particularly appropriate that this session is held in this place, which was after all a jail and is now a theatre. So I hope you enjoy it and I hope you learn from it, and now pass over to Anna to introduce the performance.
Thanks, Martin. I'm Anna Howard. I was previously the program director of Talking Justice when it ran for the last 2 years. And I'm a Castlewayne local, and I also happen to be the daughter of one of the gentlemen who'll perform tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we gather on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung, whose ancestors and their descendants are the traditional owners of this country. We acknowledge their living culture, unique role in the life of this region, and that they continue to perform age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and welcome members of their community who are with us tonight. So, Shane Howard, one of Australia's most loved and respected singer-songwriters. Martin Flanagan, one of Australia's most revered journalists. Shane and Martin were born in the same year, 2 weeks apart, both from large families. Between them, they've produced 16 books, and 16 albums. Their friendship has spanned 20 years. Shane describes Marty as one of Australia's most important thinkers. Of Marty, he says, he's a reliable witness, perhaps because of his legal background. He will only ever say things that he knows to be true. Of Shane, Marty says he admires the integrity of his creative journey. He says the one thing that people grow to respect are people who are true to their principles. And he says that this is true of Shane. He also says he's fond of him because he's a Richmond tragic. So, tonight, two Australian treasures, but in truth, my dad and his old mate yarning. So why invite artists and writers to talk about justice? As we drove up, Dad and I, together in the car today, and the ghostly grey peaks of the Grampians shrinking slowly in the rearview mirror behind us, I asked Dad what he and Marty were going to talk about tonight. I had absolutely no idea. I still don't know if I can answer that question for you, and I don't really want to spoil it, but rest assured, I think you're in for a treat. This is their reflections on justice, on injustice, and how the things that they have witnessed have shaped their creative journeys and their lives.
Good evening to you, one and all. And now for the history of jurisprudence. Blessed are those who hunger for justice, from the jails of Longkish to the custody floors. Blessed are those who hunger for the Spirit. Blessed are you who have hungered for love. Blessed are you who have asked for forgiveness, and blessed are those so quick to forgive. Blessed are you who hungered for freedom, and when I was hungry you gave me to eat. Blessed are you whose lives are forgotten in the rush and the tear of the daily grind. Blessed the children whose lives have been shattered. Blessed the first smell of rain after drought. Martin Flanagan.
About 10 years ago, on a visit to South Africa, I was confronted by the issue of torture. It started when I went to Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was held as a common prisoner for more than 20 years. Our guide, a former inmate who had been tortured, was less than wholly sane. He took us into the prison dormitory, where he was held at night, and slammed the door behind us, making people jump. "That's how they slammed it on me," he cried. Once he had everyone inside, he gave a long and detailed account of his torture. of having his body bound in chains and being dropped from a height onto a concrete floor, of having his genitals savaged by an Alsatian. At the end of the tour, he walked away from us crying, a wild jumble of emotion. By then we had passed the tiny cell where Nelson Mandela sat, conceiving the path whereby South Africa could avoid civil war. As I understand it, the principle Mandela worked on is just about the opposite to torture. Mandela said that if you treat people as if they possess integrity, and that includes your prison guards, eventually they have to treat you in the same manner. I was in South Africa attending a conference on the media. I met a lot of journalists of different races and different nationalities who'd been to prison for their belief in journalism. I met a radio journalist from Zimbabwe whose radio station had been blown up once by the Mugabe government. "What keeps you going?" I asked him. "The people," he said. "The people support us." Then I met an onlooker at the conference I'll call Stephen, which is not his name, but he has family in Zimbabwe and he was tortured there. A black man tortured by black men. I ended up going home with him and meeting his family. I played cricket with Stephen and his kids in the backyard. It was Africa at evening, lush and magnificent. Here I was playing backyard cricket being, to me, an image of Australian innocence, with a man who had been tortured, hurt horribly in a sustained and deliberate manner by a vicious, paranoid regime. There was no politics of race here. None of the 21st century's moral relativities applied. I was confronted by plain, old-fashioned evil. My friend Stephen, a small man, is a moral mountain who turned his back on the armed struggle to work for social change in non-violent ways. I will tell you one small story about Stephen. He ran me to the airport when I left. I'd lost my ticket. All I had was a piece of paper with the name and number of a Qantas official in another city. I handed over the piece of paper. The man I handed it to disappeared, and suddenly I had no way of getting home. Then, on the other side of the airport, the man from behind the counter reappeared, my piece of paper in his hand, hurrying about his duties. I said I was going over to tell him to make sure he didn't lose the piece of paper, but Stephen said, "Trust him. Sometimes it's better." And it was. I got home and a certain good spirit had been preserved. But at the airport, Stephen also said to me of his torturers, "They did terrible things to me." And I saw the fire of a pain that would never be extinguished and knew that torture is an insult to whatever it means to be human. The next part of the story happens back here in Australia shortly afterwards, when I happened to turn to the back cover of my favourite literary periodical, the New York Review of Books. That is where the most eminent of the books of the day are advertised. There, alongside one on Louisiana dance music and another on the history of Latin as a language, was a book titled Torture, in which, quote, social experts discussed the advisability of maintaining an absolute ban on torture. Suddenly, it seemed to me, torture was a subject for polite discussion like Louisiana dance music or the history of Latin as a language. Why? One answer was because it was a discussion being conducted among so-called social experts. You show me a social attitude or practice, I'll find you a social expert who'll justify it. Not long afterwards, two Australian academics from Deakin University published a paper in an American magazine arguing for the ethical validity of torture. Faced with a backlash here in Australia, one of them, I seem to recall, said the discussion of torture in America was, quote, more rational. Various polls in the United States over the previous 3 years had found majority support for the use of torture in certain circumstances. I hereby assert what I believe to be a general rule of human nature. People who approve of torture in opinion polls do so in the confidence that they are not the ones who are going to be tortured. In my increasingly eccentric sports column, I asked the question, because no one else would, What treatment did the Australian government expect Australian soldiers would receive when next taken prisoner in an Asian or Middle East war, now that we have Guantanamo Bay as a precedent? I asked as the son of a man who was lucky to survive being used as a slave labourer on the Burma Railway. And so, in response to the book advertisement on the back page of the New York Review of Books, I wrote an essay on torture which I was fortunate to get published, initially in The Age, later in an international collection. My friend Stephen helped me, singing me home when I read it to him. "Oh, Martin, Martin, Martin." The essay started, quote, "Torture, to me the most repugnant of human practices, is back in intellectual fashion." It ended, "The arguments for torture haven't really changed since the Inquisition. What has changed is what's terrifying us and who we suspect its agents among us to be." And so I made my statement. But it was what happened next that really scared me. What happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. Well, that's not exactly right. 4 Supreme Court judges from Victoria and South Australia contacted me and said it was an important article. Then I went to see former Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser about another matter. When I entered his office, I saw my essay on his desk. "Your essay's good," he said in his clipped, curt way, "but I think it's too late." My past exchanges with Fraser had taught me to respect the voluminous cavern of his brain and the amount of knowledge he could store in it. He knew about torture all right, about the chain of command from Abu Ghraib, about the rendition program, about the definition proffered by Alberto Gonzales, President Bush's legal counsel, that to qualify as torture, the pain had to cause serious physical injury, organ failure or death. Fraser said, quote, "If we embrace the methods and techniques of tyrants, we take a significant step towards becoming like them. That is the central dilemma our leaders have not resolved." It was a dark time. It seemed to me that most Australians were either not aware or didn't care that torture was becoming an idea of our time, like four-wheel drives and problems with the weather. It further seemed to me that if people were not aware torture was insinuating its way back into our public life, there would be no resistance to the idea. In my essay against torture, I noted that in America, in the period before the Civil War, to be passionately against slavery was to risk being described as, quote, morbidly anti-slavery. Mark Twain said his mother was a church-going Christian all her life and never heard a single sermon against slavery from the pulpit. I have long been a believer in the poet T.S. Eliot's dictum that humankind cannot bear too much reality. I spiralled down into a dark place. What finally gave me strength was stumbling across a history of the British anti-slavery movement, Bury the Chains, by Adam Hochschild. The anti-slavery movement is the great social struggle of the past 200 years in Britain and therefore for us in this country. So much has flowed from it, not least a new idea of politics. In the words of one of slavery's defenders, Lord Abingdon, quote, "Humanity is a private feeling and not a public principle to act upon." It is from the defeat of the slave trade that the great reform movement of the 19th century springs, and with it the belief that politics is a mechanism whereby we can progress morally as a society. It is amazing to think that a little over 200 years ago, Britain was the biggest international trafficker in slaves, that the wealth of its great ports and colonies and the prestige of its navy was insidiously tied to the trade, so that slavery's champions would include the great military hero of the day, Horatio Nelson, and the Duke of Clarence, later William IV, King of Great Britain. Nor was it merely the case that the slave owners and traffickers were the most powerful political lobby in the land. They owned whole blocks of seats in the Parliament. The odds against those who decided the slave trade must be actively opposed could not have been greater. They faced a blanket of national apathy. Wealth, power and connections were against them. But men and women stood up, a few at first and then in numbers. The story of one of those people, Thomas Clarkson, was profoundly moving to me. The background to the story of Thomas Clarkson was that in 1782, 4 years after Captain Cook saw our shores, the captain of a Liverpool ship called the Zong threw 132 sick slaves overboard and then entered an insurance claim on the basis that they qualified as perished cargo. The Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield, said there was no issue of murder. It was, quote, just as if horses were killed. That is, it was a property matter. However, the case disturbed a prominent Anglican clergyman who was subsequently elected to a professorship at Cambridge, where he was required to set the essay topic for the university's Latin prize. The subject he set was, is it lawful to make others slaves against their will? The prize was won by a young man named Thomas Clarkson, who argued that slavery was immoral. However, having completed the academic exercise, Clarkson found himself haunted by what he had written. Eventually, in the course of riding to London to begin a career in the church, he was so overwhelmed that he dismounted at Wade's Mill in Hertfordshire and, quote, sat down disconsolate. There the thought came to him that, quote, if the contents of the essay were true, it were time that some person should see these calamities to their end, unquote. He then knew no one in the world who thought as he did. William Wilberforce became the voice of the British anti-slavery movement, but Thomas Clarkson was its backbone. And one of the reasons for the success of the British anti-slavery movement is that it did indeed become a movement. For the first time in British political history, people campaigned for the political rights of others and not themselves. In my moments of despair about the world, such as I had when confronted with torture, I go back to the British anti-slavery movement. They fought bigger odds than we face now, and they won. As for torture, I believe there is an ugliness in it that surpasses all other human ugliness, even in my opinion, the death penalty. It is a deliberate act so dark it would literally take a Christ to forgive it. And while I have long known that torture existed in the world, I never thought it would touch me in any way, and when it did, even though it was only as an observer and then from a distance, I saw what torture sufferers everywhere must know, how little their plight and suffering is understood or even acknowledged by the world, and how that in turn must exacerbate their agony. And what I also know is that as a human possibility, torture is never far away. In fact, the Republican nominee for the presidency of the United States of America, Donald Trump, has just endorsed its use. There is a battle to be fought. There is always a battle to be fought.
Powerful words that bring us into focus. Justice is an eternal ubiquity and obliquity. And it's certainly not for me to try and determine what justice is. Some of the greatest minds in human history have set that task upon themselves and go on committing themselves to that definition this weekend, and the jury is still out. The great conversation goes on as we stumble increasingly perhaps towards becoming a world with generally accepted guidelines for what we believe justice to be globally. Growing up in a large family, I quickly learnt a keen sense of what is fair and what is not from my siblings. And we certainly feel deeply when we believe an injustice has been done to us by another. In a digital world, we're confronted with global injustice on a 24-hour cycle. But our beliefs are not always shared. As Martin points out in the story he just told of the struggle to outlaw slavery, considered by many to be absolutely justifiable, to the point of being defended by the English Parliament and the letter of the law. Often throughout history, the artists and the writers, the poets and the journalists, the philosophers, the religious, would turn their minds towards these issues, wrestle with the ethics and try to bring new arguments to the foreground. And often it was the media who shone a light on these issues, giving a wider audience to new ideas previously hidden from the sight of the many. I remember back in 1982 when we had just released our first single as Goanna, Solid Rock, talking to the managing director of Warner Music in Sydney. He was a man who enjoyed a drink, and he said to me one night, he said, "Shane, the artists, the poets, the painters, they write it, paint it, sing it. 20 years later, it's legislation." It's interesting how that stuck in my head and still resonates for me now as almost a truism. I don't know that I can change anyone's mind with a song, but I know that by adding a part of light to the sum of light, hidden things in time may be revealed. I can say with some personal certainty that many ideas that were considered fringe and on the periphery 30 years ago have now drifted into mainstream thinking. But change is slow and a slave to its own history. But neuroscience assures us that justice may well be hardwired into the human brain. And our punishment instincts come with inbuilt governors, including powerful urges to forgive if the right signals are received. I'm a writer and a musician, and the song Solid Rock, and with my band Goanna back in the early 80s, through me, catapulted me headfirst into mainstream commercial success, at the same time that it threw me headfirst into Aboriginal Australia, two very diametrically opposed worlds. At the same time that I was being fated in that commercial mainstream world, I was also sleeping on Aboriginal people's floors where dinner was bread and butter and jam, and seeing a very different Australia. The deepening contact and relationship for me with Aboriginal Australia right across the country made me realise that I needed to pay attention and learn from the First Nations people how to get my bearings, how to understand what Manning Clark had described as the spirit of place, the genius loci. How do we find a sense of belonging here in this landscape, in this country? Many extraordinary people showed me great friendship, great hardship, great truth, great reality. I remember in 1983 Goanna got to play for a land rights rally in Perth, and we were asked to perform. An old man from up in that Pilbara and Kimberley region was asked to speak. He was a great champion during the Nunkambar struggle and many of the great land rights struggles in the 70s and 80s, Nippertapagee. And he got up to speak, got to the microphone, and he spoke in Walmatjari, I think, quite definitively and defiantly, and then went and sat down. And everyone applauded politely, but no one knew what he said. And the woman who was convening it went over to him and spoke to him, and he nodded his head and got back up and came over and said the same thing in English. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he said something like this. He said, back in the old times, our old people were here, and some white fellas been come here. And they say, oh, okay, if we come here and stay here. And old people said, yeah, you're right, you can stay here. You can camp down there. And then after a while, those white fellas came back and they said, oh, there's some more white fellas coming, okay, if they stay with us. Yeah, you're right, they can stay down there with you, you'll be right. And then after time, a lot of white fellas started coming, and no one was asking our old people. And one time our old people went to see everyone and said, hey, hold on, too much white fellas coming now, no one's asking us, or checking. And those white fellas said, oh, you have to talk to the boss. And they said, well, who's the boss? They said, oh, King George. And they said, well, where's this King George? We want to see him. And they said, oh, well, he won't come here, maybe for a long time. And they said, well, that's no good. All our old people will be blind by then. And we're still waiting for King George. And that pretty much said it all. In 1942, in the Pilbara, in the wake of that great invasion that happened here in Australia and the consequences, the Aboriginal people of the Pilbara decided to do something about the situation that they found themselves in. And a great meeting at the Aboriginal Desert Lawmen was organised by Dooley Bin Bin, a senior lawman, Clancy McKenna, and over 200 people attended, some travelling thousands of kilometres from as far away as Halls Creek, Darwin and Alice Springs, on the eastern side of the Pilbara, where they could be away from the eyes of the squatters and the police. And there they sat in council for 6 weeks to discuss the shameful conditions that their people were living under, all through that central and western desert country. There were 23 languages spoken and 16 interpreters. And one white fella, the prospector Don McLeod, was invited to that meeting. He was one of the first white fellas to be born in Marble Bar, one of the most remote towns in Australia. He'd been invited because of the help he'd once shown to an Aboriginal elder who needed to be taken to hospital. None of the white fellas at the time would help to transport him, but McLeod took him as a matter of course and thought nothing more of it. His empathy was noted, and as a result, he was summoned to attend the Great Desert Council. The people discussed what they could do to improve the future for their children. Work and living conditions were appalling for all Aboriginal people at that time, but in the Pilbara being so remote, it was particularly harsh and out of sight and out of mind. Aboriginal people were under the Native Administration Act, and they were virtually slaves in their own country. No wages, no housing, no freedom of movement, and meagre rations. McLeod was appointed executor, and the group became known as the Mob. They walked off the stations all across the Pilbara on the same day, and the squatters could not understand how they managed such a coordinated action. They waited until the war was over in 1946. For a long time before the strike, Dooley Bin Bin, a senior man of law, had travelled by foot and push bike through the Pilbara. He was an older man, and when the squatters inquired as to what that old man was doing on the station, they would say, oh, he's a poor old relation who's come to visit, he's probably going to finish up soon. But what Dooley was really doing was giving everyone a calendar and showing them the current date and instructing them to mark off every day with a red cross until they came to the day of the walk-off. Like I said, they waited until the Second World War ended. And in 1946, they went on strike, walked off sheep stations all across the northwest of Western Australia. Under the guidance of McLeod, Bin Bin and McKenna, the strike was well organised, and initially it stunned the authorities. All three were arrested and jailed and persecuted. Although the strike effectively lasted 3 years, it never officially ended. Dooley Bin Bin challenged senior police by asking, how much room you got in your jails? We'll fill them all. The strike was about much more than 30 shillings a week, for wages and better conditions. They began agitating for rights, dignity and proper entitlements in their own country. In order to survive away from the stations, the mob established their own camps. They traded kangaroo and goat skins. Under Don McLeod's direction, they began alluvial mining with Yandees, like a Coolamon, until they could afford equipment. Ironically, their successful mining operations drew attention to the mineral wealth of the Pilbara. They supported themselves this way for over 20 years, acquired 3 stations, established schools, teaching the local language and developing a way of life based on Aboriginal communal organisation. The mob had solid supporters like the Communist Party, some of the churches, particularly the Anglican Church, women's groups and a small group of artists. The Fremantle branch of the Seamen's Union refused to load the squatters' wool on boats while the strike was on, and eventually the Australian Workers' Union supported the mob's claims for wages and better conditions. When West Australia was first established as a state by the settlers, the Constitution made provision for a small percentage of state revenue to be allocated to Aboriginal people. McLeod turned bush lawyer and went on to argue that this had been illegally changed in the West Australian Constitution, and he continued to agitate for restitution. It was never achieved. He also went on to support other actions for justice for Aboriginal people, including the fight against oil drilling on Aboriginal land at Noonkanbah in the Kimberley region of West Australia in the late 1970s. At one level, the strike collapsed, but like the Eureka Stockade, it was a victory won from a battle lost. Many gains were made. There were also bitter disappointments and much obstruction by authorities, and the mob struggled to hold it all together. It's a blight on the history of our governments that failed to support this bold model. A little vision by governments could have seen a model evolve for remote communities. There are so many wonderful characters in this heroic story to celebrate for their incredible efforts against impossible odds as a small group of disempowered but dedicated people. Peter Coppin, the songman Donald Norman, Daisy Bindi, Ernie Mitchell and so many more heroes that can take credit for giving birth to the Aboriginal land rights movement and inspiring the Gurindji walk-off at Wave Hill in the 1960s. In the foreword to Max Brown's book, Black Eureka, the writer Dorothy Hewitt wrote, "A little mob of Norwest Aborigines without status, funds or human rights challenged the feudal strongholds of squatters, missions, courts, newspaper barons and governments, all the way up to the United Nations. It is a classic story of the underdog and his uncountable resources. It records the birth of the militant Aboriginal movement, and it's part of Australian history now." Too much talking and not enough singing. I was moved to write this song after I found out everything I could about that incredible story that is not widely known in this country, but deserves to be. Listen to my story, it's a mighty tale indeed. Bravery and decency against self-interest and greed. Northwest Australia, mighty Pilbara, Nickatha and Nullaga, the grain and marble bar, the sound of freedom. It was coming on the wind, the song was freedom. The way people sing, squatters' Springs, the desert lawmen came. They traveled in from far and wide, some 1,000 miles away. There they sat in council, there they spoke the law, and they named MacLeod the spokesman for the future they foresaw. And then they parted. They were fading in the heat, and they were traveling into history. You can't deny me when the truth is where it stays. But don't put flowers on his grave, help him now. And if you're going to start a job, better be prepared to follow through. Just like Clancy and Dewey and Don MacLeod. Word spread to Mother Bob, Nicky Thad and two. Another kind to grain, and then clear down the Fortescue. May 1 was the day, 1946. 800 native workers walked away from the squatters' tricks and the sound of freedom. It was ringing in the wind, the song was freedom. The way the people sing, remember. Station after station, Dooley spread the word. Right, he spread the strike while Clancy back on. MacLeod worked on the walls, saving wages he didn't need, to send supplies to the strikers, things like flour and sugar and tea. He sang about freedom. It was ringing in the wind, the song was freedom. The way the people sing. Help him now. And if you're gonna start a job, better be prepared to follow through. Just like Clancy and Dooley and Don MacLeod. They had to stick it out. They had to find a way, something better for their people than to live their lives as slaves. They threatened on MacLeod, and he took them all. Working style report, all the seedy goings on. Years came and went, the people toughed it out. Grab a hunt again, there'd be slaves that live in doubt. Out of sight, out of mind, there's no happy ending here. Betrayal after betrayal, slowly wearied by the years. I was thinking about Lincoln Bar, thinking about Wave Hill, thinking of all the people who are struggling out there still at the sound of freedom. Carry on the wind, the song of freedom. The way the old ones sing. Don't put flowers on his grave, help him now. And if you're gonna start a job, better be prepared to follow through. Just like Clancy, Dooley and Don MacLeod. Just like Clancy and Dooley and Don MacLeod.
In 1971, I was 16 and the deputy head boy of a Catholic boarding school in Tasmania. One night, two much younger boys, maybe 12 or 13, came to see me and the school captain in a highly emotional state. I will call one of the boys the reporter and the other the victim. The reporter named a priest and said, "Look what he has done." The priest had ejaculated on the victim's back. The head prefect, myself, and one other senior boy went and told the rector, and the priest was shipped interstate. At university, I did a law degree. I knew what I had seen that night in 1971 was evidence, not hearsay, and I always thought one day it would return to me. Sure enough, 30-odd years later, it did. I got a call from the police station in the town where I'd gone to school, asking me if I had anything to say in relation to allegations of sexual misconduct at my old school in that particular year. I had long ago made up my mind about what I was going to do if ever I was contacted. The trauma of the boy that night, he was shaking uncontrollably, was like I later saw in car accident victims. Over the years, I had thought of contacting him to offer some message of support, but my experiences as a journalist, in particular a story to do with a serial rapist, had taught me not to make assumptions about the way people pattern sexual traumas of this kind into their lives. You might be reminding them of something they don't wish to be reminded of. They might not have told their family, their partner, their wife, their mates. But when the police rang, I was untroubled to say I was happy to provide a statement, which I did. The hardest thing was being certain of my memory of the incident. I replayed it again and again in my mind. In the end, the one thing I could say for certain was that my memory of the event never altered, and that was what I was going to say if asked in court. I am not a creature who can hide his doubts. They emerge like demons at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then the long dark night begins. But about this, I never had any doubt, and I invited them to appear. I never had that other moment either, the one when you suddenly remember something relevant to the whole case that you'd otherwise forgotten, that throws a different light on the matter. Because I had a law degree at university, I also knew the prohibition against witnesses colluding. The temptation was to ring the boy who had been the school captain and check my evidence against his, but I didn't do that. Then I learned that another former student was also giving evidence for the prosecution. That bothered me. I didn't remember that individual being present. Let's call him the third witness. My great good fortune in the whole affair is that I had told one of my older brothers, Tim Flanagan, about the incident when it occurred. He believed me. My mother didn't. My father listened but said nothing. This didn't bother me. At the time, my mother and I were fiercely at war over religion. I didn't expect her to believe me because it was totally outside the orbit of her experience. But after I'd made the statement I intended giving to the police, I rang my brother Tim and read it to him. He said, "Well, that's what you told me when you were 16. That gave me strength. To be frank, my training as a journalist also helped me in making my statement. I understand what it means to make public utterances and then have to stand by them. I also wanted to say exactly what I had to say and nothing more. I found a peculiar relief in the fact that I didn't have to judge the priest or sentence him. I merely had to give my testimony. This realisation actually gave me more respect for the legal system. It distributes the load of criminal justice, which for anyone with sensitive shoulders is a very big load. Being part of a process that can send a man to prison and destroy his reputation forever is no small matter. Meanwhile, my mother and father, by now very old people, were strongly supportive of me testifying. I was reminded that I wasn't acting purely on my own behalf. The priest was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. After the trial, standing outside the courthouse, I met the victim. He didn't seem to me to want to have a conversation about the incident, but I did say I'd never forgotten him or what had happened. I also met the person I referred to earlier as the third witness. the one who gave evidence against the priest that I couldn't remember being present on the night. Initially hearing there was a third witness had spooked me a bit. If the third witness was right, my memory was wrong. Equally, if I was right, he was wrong, and to that extent the trial had been corrupted. But as it turned out, the third witness had met the victim elsewhere that night in the dormitory toilets, quote, crying his eyes out. The third witness, now a lawyer, was utterly clear about his memory, and I was in no doubt he had seen what he said. It was another year or so before I caught up with the school captain. That was quite a meeting, let me say. I had seen little of him since leaving school, but during our school days, we had known one another in a reasonably intimate way. We'd lived together for 6 years. So, of course, I asked him, "What was your testimony when we went to court?" Remember, I said that this all began when a boy I called the reporter approached the school captain and me and said a crime had been committed against the boy I called the victim. His memory of the whole event had faded more than mine. Nonetheless, our testimonies corresponded, except for this one respect. The boy I said was the reporter, he said was the victim. And the boy I said was the victim, he said was the reporter. I now see more clearly why some lawyers, particularly judges, are wary of convicting people on testimony that is 30 years old. Get any 8 people who shared a dramatic experience 30 years ago in a room, issue them with pens and paper, and then ask them to record their memory of that distant drama. There will be many discrepancies. Nonetheless, I am satisfied that in the case in which I gave evidence, justice was done. I don't regret giving evidence. My memory of the night in question still replays in exactly the same way in my mind. But the story doesn't end there. The priest went to prison. No one visited him. So my brother Tim did. Not once, but a number of times, writing to him also. As some of you may know, my father Archie was on the Burma Railway, the war crime committed by the Imperial Japanese Army, in which between 100 and 200,000 men died, laying 400 kilometres of track. By the time he got back from that ordeal, the entire Bible, Old Testament and New, had compressed in Dad's mind to 3 lines, which he continued muttering into very old age. Those lines were, "I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me." Some people didn't like my brother Tim going to visit the priest in prison, but I was so proud of him.
I don't know if I'd have that kind of strength of compassion. I was born and raised in southwest Victoria, big Irish Catholic community, one of the highest concentrations of Irish migration in Australia, outside of the cities, but per capita, the highest concentration of migration. So a kind of Anglo-Celtic ghetto. And in 1993, Mary Black recorded one of my songs, and it was very successful in Ireland, and she invited me then to come to Ireland and tour, which I did with a band, a small band from Australia, a couple of guys. It was an amazing tour to my mother's grandmother had come to Australia as a a very young girl, an orphan, from the famine that saw over a million people starve to death, and much more than that, evacuate the country in very desperate circumstances that brought them to Canada and America and New Zealand and Australia. So here was I going back. We did 5 nights in Dublin, and then we were to head north, and we were to go up into the north of Ireland. I'd never been up there before, and cross the border. And we were in a car, the other 2 Australian musicians and myself, and we're heading up the motorway to Belfast. This is 1993. There's still a lot of trouble going on, but we're naive Australians. Not our story, it's not our problem. And about 5 kilometres from the border, a car went past us and flung a stone up that smashed our windscreen, or shattered the windscreen. So we had to pull over, and we got a roll of gaffer tape out, if you know what gaffer tape is. It holds the music industry together. And we thought we were very clever. We put it right all across the window, and were able to remove the whole thing in one piece, and thought ourselves very clever indeed, until we drove off. It was freezing. It was a really cold day. And we're driving about 80 kilometres an hour, and our faces are frozen. And so we pull over again, and Bill says, "I've got just the thing," and grabs his bag out of the back and pulls out 2 balaclavas. And he and Tim put them on. And instinctively, I knew that driving to the border of Northern Ireland with 2 balaclavas and a broken window was probably not going to end well. I said, "Take them off." And as the reality of the situation sunk into them, then we became paranoid about what to do with them, so we ended up throwing them out the window and proceeded on. And we got to the border, and of course we were stopped there. There's huge towers that are bomb-proof, and it was quite confronting for someone coming from this country. And everybody's white. You can't tell who's different. Everybody's white people, I mean. And except for the soldier who came over to check us out, and he was a very dark-skinned Londoner. "Hello, what we got here?" you know. And he's opened up the back. "What's in the back?" "What's that?" I said, "Oh, it's a didgeridoo." He said, "What's it do?" I said, "It's a musical instrument." I said, "Would you like me to play it for me?" But he was humourless, and he said, "No, put it back." You know, showed it to a senior officer. They looked down it and put it back, and he looked at our passports. He said, this very dark man, he said, "You're a long way from home." And let the irony of that just hang in the air for a minute. And then we noticed out in these trenches to the side of the road, there's a whole group of soldiers in battle fatigues with guns trained on us. The gravity of that moment was kind of overwhelming. Mirrors and bomb checks under the car and whatever, and it was a recurring theme as we drove through the north. And one night we were back at the hotel after a gig, and because Mary's band were great company and great musicians, and we'd always have a session pretty much after the gig. We were back talking, and someone mentioned, "Oh, you know about the Miami show band massacre?" And I said, and I laughed because I thought they were going to pull my leg with another Irish joke. But it wasn't a joke. It was a real band, the Miami show band. They were a great, really popular band, cabaret band that went all around Ireland in the 70s. There were Catholic and Protestant musicians in that band. And there'd been an action by the UVF and a collusion between government and police and UVF paramilitary forces, and that bus got blown up in a series of terrible events, and nearly all those people were killed, including one of the musicians from Mary Black's band, his brother. And you realise you're forced to take a side. And I think Marty had a similar experience when he was in Ireland, that people call you very quickly, you know, you're Catholic or Protestant? And you go, well, I'm kind of not anything really. I'm kind of, I'm a child of the 60s, and it's like, you're Catholic. And so I wrote this song about that experience, and how do we find a pathway to that kind of justice when we feel so aggrieved, so deeply aggrieved, and both parties feel aggrieved. And it's old and it's historical. And you think you're an Australian and it's not your story, but of course you're as free as stone. Phone calls and taxi rides, somebody's leaving. Misunderstandings can get out of control, and the right words get left, and the wrong words get spoken. She's gone, but not your pride. I got you now, you're the picture of sorrow. Head in your hand, like a scene from a movie, and all of the things that once seemed so important are leaves that are blown away. Nothing can hurt the full heart that's breaking. Can't find the words, and you won't hide the feelings, and it's down to the bone, to the heart of the matter. You're free, you're free as stone. Walking through Belfast on a cold Sunday morning, young soldiers in their uniforms, guns in their hands, the world all cut up with barbed wire fences. I'm free as stone. Nothing can help the full heart that's breaking. You can't find the words, and you won't hide the feelings, and it's down to the bone, to the heart of the matter. You're free as stone. It's down to
Anna Politkovskaya was murdered outside her Moscow apartment on October 7, 2006. She was shot 3 times in the body, once in the head. The pistol was left at the scene of the crime, the signature of a contract killing. She was a journalist. The then President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, made no comment on her death for 3 days and then argued in effect that the Russian authorities had no reason to have her killed since she had minimal impact on domestic politics. The view put out by the Kremlin was that Politkovskaya's murder was engineered by forces in the West to embarrass Russia in the eyes of the world. The following year, reviewing Politkovskaya's last book in the New York Times, Andrew Meyer wrote, quote, "Russia under Putin, Politkovskaya believed, is a diseased state." In this final work, she gave us a near stenographic record of her country's descent. The emergence of a petro-state fuelled by rising oil prices, as well as a willingness to sacrifice civil liberties, along with, when necessary, its own citizens. The set pieces in her diary read like an unfiltered newsfeed that reveals the greater malaise. Putin at a Kremlin round table encircled by cowed former dissidents. And the rise of Ramzan Kadyrov, described as Politkovskaya as the deranged and virtually brain-dead lunatic warlord Putin tapped to rule Chechnya. In 2009, I raised the subject of Ramzan Kadyrov and his human rights record in my weekly sports column. Why? Because Kadyrov had a starter in the following Tuesday's Melbourne Cup. Another horse owned by Kadyrov was expected to run in the following Saturday's Emirates Stakes. And nobody said a thing except for then Senator Bob Brown. He said if Kadyrov's horse won, it would be the low point in Australian sporting history. He was right. In an article on Politkovskaya in the New York Review of Books in 2008, Amy Knight wrote that Politkovskaya believed she had a mission to report on the dirty war in Chechnya that the Putin regime had launched in the autumn of 1999. By the time of her death, Politkovskaya had made at least 50 trips to Chechnya, a savage and dangerous place that most other Russian journalists avoided. Knight wrote, quote, "Her subjects were the innocent victims of the war, ordinary civilians, whether Russian or Chechen, whose lives had been ruined by the conflict. She described maimed bodies, burned corpses, the destruction of entire villages. She wrote about hapless Russian soldiers conscripted into the army and sent off to Chechnya, where they were often treated like slaves by their commanders. They witnessed cruelties that went beyond the bounds of normal warfare and were themselves treated cruelly by the Chechens when captured." The New York Review of Books article described Ramzan Kadyrov as, quote, "the violent and corrupt young Chechen whom Putin installed in the Chechen government." As Politkovskaya reported, Kadyrov's militia was and still is notoriously brutal against the resistance, kidnapping, torturing and killing innocent civilians by the hundreds. In early 2000, Politkovskaya had written, quote, "I thought that maybe I should not write about everything I see. Maybe I should spare you, the public, all, so that you can continue to enjoy your life thinking that the army and the new government are doing the right thing in northern Caucasus. Maybe. But I know for sure that when we wake up, it will be too late." Just 2 days before her murder, Politkovskaya was interviewed on Radio Liberty about her ongoing investigation of Kadyrov and the crimes committed by his militia, which she had documented with videotapes and photographs given to her by eyewitnesses. Politkovskaya told Radio Liberty, quote, "Personally, I only have one dream for Kadyrov's birthday. I dream of him sitting someday in the dock in a trial that meets the strictest legal standards with all of his crimes listed and investigated." In an essay written 2 months before her death and published posthumously in the Washington Post, Politkovskaya wrote, "Why has Ramzan Kadyrov vowed to kill me? I once interviewed him and printed the interview just as he gave it, complete with all his characteristic moronic stupidity, ignorance and satanic inclinations. Ramzan was sure I would completely rewrite the interview and present him as intelligent and honourable. That, after all, is what they call journalism in Russia today," unquote. I'm a journalist. Anyone who wants to study the full paradox of journalism in a setting closer to home than Russia should read Hack Attack, journalist Nick Davies' book about the Murdoch-owned News of the World phone-tapping scandal in Britain. The book is a portrait of the cringingly weak, ambitious and vicious types who created and encouraged a media culture in which phone tapping, a practice remarkably similar to blackmail, became acceptable. It is also an unforgettable portrait of the corrupt relationship between the political and media elite in Britain over 3 decades, and as such it will be read and valued long after the characters in the book are dead. But at the same time as Hack Attack exposed one part of the world of journalism, it is itself the work of a journalist. And that is the paradox of journalism. Journalism is a profession that attracts all types. It attracts shallowly ambitious creatures who soon work out how to rise in corporate media structures. But it also attracts fearless crusaders for the truth. Anna Politkovskaya's former husband described her in this way. Her sense of justice was the focal point of her life. Lying was forbidden. One must always tell the truth. That was the principle she always lived by, and it was precisely what took her to Chechnya. I don't claim to be in the class of people like Anna Politkovskaya, but I do know as a fact that they exist. In 2015, around the world, 72 journalists were murdered for getting too close to truths that certain groups, powerful individuals and governments did not want spoken. 40% of the stories that the murdered journalists were working on involved human rights. In the same year around the world, 199 journalists were in jail, one of them for a time being Australian Peter Grester for reporting on the ousting of Egypt's democratically elected Islamic government. I am best known as a sports writer. Sport is adult make-believe. Mostly I choose to believe. Sport for me is like a holiday from the real world. But sooner or later, to the real world I must return. I have spent my journalistic career trying to tell good news. That is, standing witness to the good in the world. My aim has never been to make good news, nor to enhance or exaggerate it, certainly not to trivialise or sentimentalise it, but merely to record its often unremarkable presence in the world. I see this as my contribution to our collective mental health. But I have never thought we should or could afford to ignore the bad news of the world, and periodically, whether we like it or not, we are all ripped awake to some appalling brutality or institutionalised wrongdoing. What I know is that there are people who will die to get that story to the world. That is my faith.
Late in 1982, we had the Year of the Public. Solid Rock had been a huge commercial success. We had the Year of Commercial Radio, and I met Bob Brown. I'd been following the whole story that was unfolding down in Tasmania with the campaign, with the damming, the proposal to dam the Franklin River, and the campaign that opposed the damming of that river. And I'd seen Peter Dombrovskis's beautiful photographs, compelling photographs of that extraordinary and unique wilderness. I'd also seen the photos of Olegus Trichanis, of Lake Pedder, one of the great environmental follies of the 20th century, where that lake, the Goddess's Bath, one of the natural wonders of the world really, was dammed for hydroelectricity. In the scheme of geological time, how long does a dam last? Until the concrete crumbles. Not that long, really, in geological time. And I think a lot of people my age and older, and people from Tasmania who loved the natural environment, were motivated to not allow something as stupid as that to happen again when it came to the Franklin River. I met Bob Brown in Sydney, and I said, I'd like to try and write a song. And he said, well, you got to go down there. You got to go down and see the place for yourself so you know what's at stake. And so I did, and Bob was a great help me get that together. And we went down to the Franklin early in 1983, and I saw for myself, I stood in the presence of 3,000 and 4,000-year-old Huon pine trees. You know, that were big trees before Christ even was on the earth. And I was deeply moved by all these young people who gave of their own time and their energy at their own expense to be there. And you had to go to base camp and do your non-violent action training first before you went upriver to know how to be arrested peacefully and passively. At the end of the day, I returned. I wasn't allowed to get arrested because I had 5 days. 5 days after we went down to the Franklin River, I had to be back in Melbourne for a major concert that Midnight Oil had convened called Stop the Drop, which was an anti-nuclear campaign. And I had to write the song and get it finished in those 5 days. And we performed it at that Stop the Drop concert. It was recorded and filmed, and that went out from there. And Bob was very supportive all the way through, giving us footage and access to people to try and get that out. The songs don't necessarily change the world, I know. But art has a really important role to play in. We had the ear of the public at the time. We were able to release that song and get it onto commercial radio and keep the story alive in the media when it was beginning to wane from the pages, the newspapers. And Bob knew that too. He was shrewd enough, I'm sure. Why did the Franklin get saved? Bob Hawke made an election promise. He won government. Robin Gray, the Premier of Tasmania at the time, said, no way. The state has jurisdiction over its own territory, and they took it to the High Court, of course, and the High Court resolved that the federal government has the capacity to intervene on over the states on issues of national significance, and the Franklin River was saved. But had it not been for the agitation of all those young people down the rivers, drawing attention, drawing the media, all those incredible photographers, all those filmmakers, the painters, the writers, the journalists, getting the story out, I don't know that it would have been saved. months later, we did our first tour of Tassie. At the Burnie Civic Centre, the promoter said before we did the show, he said, "Don't play the Franklin song." He said, "It's a hot potato here, don't do it." Because in those days, if you had a no damn sticker on your car window, your window would get smashed. It divided families in Tassie. Anyway, young and stupid, we led off with it, of course. And the Burnie Civic Centre erupted into disorder, ladies and gentlemen. But a few nights later, we were down Hobart Way around the Foreshore Tavern, and after the show, which was great, things were fairly barbaric in those days, and if they changed at all, and there were cans and strewn all over the floor after everyone had left, and there were guys going around with metal rakes raking them up. That was the sophisticated way they did things in those days. And this one fella came up to me, everyone had gone, and I was just hanging back with the road crew, they were packing up. This bloke came up with a rake and he said, "I should wrap this around your effing head." And I said, "What would you want to do that for?" He said, "Oh, you and your greeny lefty mates." Anyway, I had a swing and I ducked and I didn't get that one, and unfortunately the crew came to my aid in the nick of time, and I was spared a rake through the head. But I felt for that guy afterwards when I reflected on that, and how so often the big end of town gets to manipulate the little end of town, and in many ways get them to do their bidding for them. It was hard to know then how that was going to work out, but the reality is that Strawn, which was a dying timber town in those days, is now a thriving tourist town. 1,000 people being arrested and bailed. There has to be something worth fighting for. Voices crying in a wilderness, saying this is something worth fighting for. Let the Franklin fall, let the wildlands be. Wilderness should be strong, free. Kodakina to the southwest shore. Has to be something worth fighting for. Franklin fall, let the wildlands be. Take good care of this country. Kodakina to the southwest shore. Has to be something worth fighting for. Thank you.
About 10 years ago, there was a great documentary made called Lian Yan, and it was made by a guy called Bill Johnson. And Bill Johnson was English, and he came from Liverpool, where he'd been in a seminary with Pete Postlethwaite, who later became a great English actor. Bill Johnson, they'd both left the seminary without becoming priests, and Bill Johnson came to West Australia, married, and adopted an Aboriginal kid called Louis St John Johnson. And one night Louis St John Johnson was walking home and a car stopped. He was assaulted and then driven over and left for dead. And Bill Johnson, he got home but he died of the injuries. And so Bill Johnson rang Pete Postlethwaite and got him to come to Australia, and he teamed him with Archie Roach. And Archie took Pete Postlethwaite on a sort of guided tour of Australia. And the first place they went was the very place where Louis St John Johnson was assaulted and murdered. And then that was when Pete Postlethwaite learnt that the two young white guys that had killed him were not Australian, they were English, and they'd only been in the country 3 weeks. One of their mates had got assaulted by an Aboriginal youth and they'd gone out to get a black. So after this, going around Australia, going into the desert, spending time with tribal people in the desert, spending quite a bit of time with Patrick Dodson, and being informed about this great dramatic subplot in Australian history that never goes away. At the conclusion of the documentary, what Pete Postlethwaite said, and I think it's the most interesting thing I've ever heard an English person say about Australia. He said, terra nullius, the idea that this was the land of nobody, that it wasn't just a legal doctrine, that it actually amounts to our creation myth, or one of our primal creation myths. And because of that, forgetting is so much easier. And because of that, we don't have to think about issues to do with remote Aboriginal communities. And I think we all, to some extent, non-Aboriginal Australians, I don't just mean white Australians, I mean non-Aboriginal Australians with all the races and colours that now includes, I think we still live in that state. And someone like Shane, who has been engaged with Aboriginal Australia for most of his life, I thought I'd like to ask you, mate, when was the moment when it came home to you that there was this other reality in this country that you could not ignore?
Well, growing up, Marty, in southwest Victoria, Aboriginal people were a fact of life. I mean, we had a mission, the old Framingham mission was to the northeast, and the Lake Conda mission was to the northwest of us, not far away. A reasonable sized Aboriginal community surrounded us. And so I was at school with, not a lot, but I would, sporting days, I would keep coming across Aboriginal people who I got to know. And some of whom were my friends and who I really liked. One fellow in particular who was a great mate. And I remember being on the street as a little kid, what you remember, with my mother, only 3 or 4 years old, and her talking to Aboriginal women. And it wasn't until years and years and years later I said to my mum, who were those women? And it was Uncle Banjo Clark's mother and another woman, Auntie Jessie Taylor, and who was a friend of my mum's mother. And I realised I was just part of a continuum, really. But I was about 16 or 17, and a mate of mine who played music, we were walking down the street in Warrnambool one Saturday afternoon. The shops closed down in those days. The streets were pretty deserted, and we saw these Aboriginal kids used to gather over in this one little area and hang out there. And we knew to leave them alone. They were a pretty wild mob. And all of a sudden, one of the young Aboriginal blokes came across the road, and he had a large bottle of beer in his hand, but it was empty. And as he got towards us, and I could tell he was coming kind of menacingly, we were minding our own business, he smashed it on the curbing as he got to us, and he came straight at me and held it up to my throat, and he said, I should slit your effing throat. And funny what you do in those moments. And I just looked him in the eye and said, why would you want to do that? And he didn't. And he threw the bottle down on the ground and walked away. But Aboriginal Australia came crashing into my life at that point. And everything attendant to that. Why? Why is this guy so angry? You know, it's not just grog. Why? And I probably spent the rest of my life trying to unravel that. I've got to say, just to qualify that, Marty, that most of my life in Aboriginal Australia has been... That is the most violent experience I ever had in Aboriginal Australia.
Yeah. So
What about you? What led you into engaging? Because this is an interesting area. You have championed through your writing and through the age and your books. You've championed the Aboriginal story. Where you found it and the things that have inspired you.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think Shane and I are both Irish Australians, but we have very interesting similarities and very interesting differences. And one of the major differences is that I'm Tasmanian and he's Victorian. And Tasmania is a totally different psychology to Victoria, and it's a totally different history. And as you fly over Bass Strait, that used to have the great seal colonies. They're not there anymore. And the symbol of the state is the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, not there anymore. And there used to be whales in the Derwent River, not there anymore. And you grow up with the face of this old Aboriginal woman, Truganini. And her story, I mean, I could talk for 3 hours about Truganini, but her story is Shakespearean. It's a hugely dramatic story with so many levels and so many aspects to it. And you grow up with that. And it's a haunting image. There's this one particular haunting face. And when I first came to Melbourne, which was in 1985, I remember periodically you'd meet smart asses who'd say, you know, you're from Tassie, you killed all the blackfellas down there, didn't you? And it took me a while to realise that whatever had happened in Tasmania, I knew one story. One Aboriginal story, and I knew it well. And it was years. I was in Melbourne for years before I met anyone who could tell me the story of one Aboriginal person from Melbourne. And it wasn't really till I met Shane and Neil Murray and started to hear the stories of the land in Gippsland and Western Victoria that I began to see that Tasmania and Victoria were actually a lot more closely connected than I thought. But we were taught at school that there were no Aboriginal people in Tasmania. You know, as it turns out, my son-in-law has Tasmanian Aboriginal heritage and my grandson has Tasmanian Aboriginal heritage. But at school we were taught that there were no Aboriginal people in Tasmania. And I mean, the drama of that is just enormous, and it goes into Darwinian theory, it goes into all manner of 19th century dramas. And manners. And then the incident happens, which is like Shane's incident. I was playing footy and a few of us are half drunk up the back of West Hobart one night, and we had a bloke in our team called Boong. Don't even know why he was called that, but that's what he was called. And he was up the other end of the street, and I'm yelling out to him, "Hey, Boong, hey, come on, hurry up." And all of a sudden out of this house shot 20 dark-skinned, highly upset young men, and they attacked us. And I remember this bloke's coming at me swinging punches, and I'm thinking, Jesus, he looks like Lionel Rose, this bloke. And it was at that point that I realised that what we had been taught in school was not the whole truth. And that's when the great journey and the great desire to understand, because for me growing up in Tasmania, I was of Irish convict descent. The families had hidden the convict to escape the shame, but in so doing they lost their bridge to their culture. Those convicts probably spoke the Irish language. They lost their songs, their dances, their stories. So there was one great silence. Then on top of it there was this second great silence, which is what had happened to the people who lived here before my people came, the Aboriginal people. And in my case I had a third silence because I had a father who'd been to war and survived the war crime and didn't speak about it. So I had these three silences, and to a large extent my writing life has been about bridging that silence or finding a credible position from which to stand within it and have a voice. But as far as your work's concerned, Shane, you've got this great iconic song, Solid Rock. What drew you to Uluru, and what was it about Uluru that made you write that song?
I've ruminated long and hard on that. There's an aspect of what makes you not turn away, because I think a lot of people do have stories with Aboriginal Australia, and it would be very easy to go, that's too hard, and to turn away. I guess Uluru was a real turning point for me. I read a lot. There wasn't a lot available in those days, say through the 70s or early 80s, 70s, say, growing up. We were taught nothing really. You might see old man David Blanassi, we didn't know who he was back then, on Rolf Harris's Walkabout show playing Didgeridoo, or there were postage stamps, or there was the Noble Savage, this image of Aboriginal people standing on one foot holding a spear. There was romantic images, but all I saw around me was a really broken thing. And I guess I went looking to see if was culture still there, was language still there, was cultural practice and dance and art, did it still exist? And I went to Uluru, I guess, to look for that. And by a bizarre, by strange...
How old were you then?
I'm in my 20s, yeah.
Early 20s?
Early 20s, yeah. I'd been hitchhiking before that when I was 19 up the east coast of Australia. Met lots of Aboriginal people, slept under the Harbour Bridge with all the parkies, and there was one old Aboriginal man who was stolen generation, had never found his family, and he was an old gentleman, playing guitar in the park with a couple of Murray fellas in King George Square in Brisbane. I was as down on my luck as they were, but I could get the grog from the bottle shop because they weren't allowed in. Lots of little stories like that were beautiful encounters, but I went looking for something deeper, and by quirk of coincidence, the people from Armada, who had very strong connections to Uluru, had in their recovery, they were in their beginnings of their recovery, and they were going back to Uluru to establish a little artefact tent where they could sell artefacts and make a few bob. But really what was going on is it was an embassy, really. They were really there to get the country back. And I just happened to intersect with that moment in history. Met a couple of amazing people, Peter Yates, who went on to be instrumental in the whole Western Central Desert art movement, and Pat Durango, who still works for the Central Land Council, non-Indigenous people, and some amazing Indigenous people. In Ma, I experienced, I suppose, an Inma dance there that was compellingly beautiful, spiritual, aesthetically beautiful, haunting. It began in the firelight as the full moon rose over the back of Uluru. It was a transformative moment for me, like very deep transformative moment when I realised there's a really deep intelligence at work here. This is not a primitive people. This is a highly civilised cultural reality. And from then I was called powerfully to look deeper into that world, and I've spent my life doing that, and it's a bottomless well, as any cultural reality is. And it's a myth to think that, I read this, I forget the writer, but writing about justice, and that it's a bit of a modern myth to think that ancient societies were primitive and that their forms of justice were brutal. And he maintains, in fact, that the opposite is true. Someone in a traditional Aboriginal reality would no more cut the hand off an offender than we would cut the hand off our sister for doing something wrong. And yet these practices still happen today in the world, and happened in the Spanish conquest of South America. So who is really primitive here? I wasn't sure that the God of my ancestors had any sway out there in the desert. Lots of big questions came up, and lots of even moral questions were challenged, I guess. Like in a traditional reality, take with the Western world away from Australia, in a traditional reality, if an Aboriginal woman has twins, in a hard season, all three aren't going to make it. And she has to make a choice. You know, that's not a moral issue, that's actually a pragmatic issue about survival. And that's challenging.
And in that song, like I've heard Aboriginal people say how shocked they were when they heard Solid Rock, because for the first time here on commercial radio is this song which is expressing an Aboriginal reality and an Aboriginal perspective. And one of the climaxes of the song is when you talk about terra nullius, and then comes the line, "Someone lied." That's a big line. At that moment you're committing yourself to a political position. Did you realise at the time that that was what you were doing?
Look, it was the next song I wrote. We were nobodies at the time that I wrote that song. So I didn't have any sense of any great outcome for that song. And I know I did wrestle with that line. I edited myself. I wanted to say Captain Cook lied, and I do now. But at the time I just said someone lied. And it's really true, like you were talking before, Marty, about the foundation. We are such a mess, really. We've got so much work to do, so much catching up to do to even get to our ground zero point as a nation. We haven't got there yet. We have no meaningful treaty with our First Nations people. There was never a war declared here. There was no suing for peace. No treaty was ever signed. Nothing has changed in this country from a legal perspective for Aboriginal people. They are still the lords of their land. And there are no real instruments to prove that we have any legal right to be here, other than back in England. The whole notion, I don't know why Captain Cook, Lieutenant Cook he was at the time when he came here, I don't know why he took possession of Australia, of the east coast of New South Wales as it was called then, took possession of that on behalf of the Crown. He was given specific instructions by the Admiralty to negotiate just and fair outcomes with native people. So it's still a mystery to me why he failed to do that, or why he couldn't manage any level of engagement, meaningful engagement, and chose in the end to go to a deserted island to raise the British flag, which was the last point right at the tip of Cape York before he sailed away back to England. And he's only a lieutenant, he can't make those empire-changing decisions on his own. He must have had a secret letter, burn after reading. It's the only conclusion I can come to as to why terra nullius was ever established here.
Do you want to get up and sing it then?
Oh, you have to join me on the chorus as much.
One really funny thing Shane said to me once, that you thought the reason it slipped into the mainstream culture was that a lot of DJs thought Solid Rock was about a solid rock and roll song, and it was just
That might have been part of the trick, eh? ain't nothing changing, not in a hurry anyway. Can feel the endlessness, the coming of the light of day, talking about a chosen place. You wanna sell it in the market. Yeah, just a minute and now. Yeah, you're standing on solid rock, standing on sacred ground, living on borrowed time, and the winds change, they're blowing in that line. And about the dawn time, dreaming again, proud people come, living here in a promised land, running from a high darkness, searching for a part of light. This could be paradise. They were standing on solid rock, standing on sacred ground, living on borrowed time, and the winds of change, they're blowing cold at night. Standing on the shore one day, what rose white sails in the sun. Wasn't long before you felt that sting. White man, white bull, white gun, tell me it's justified. Someday, yeah, Captain Cool-Eyed, it's hard enough just to survive. There's that grind. Yeah, but we're getting stronger now, stronger now. We get it together in this country, standing on Holy Kumpunka, Narani, Wanta Milmil Pakatu, Nutu Wiruka, Narani, Warpaka, Chaparani, Warpaka Ringani, Holy Kumpunka, Narani, Wanta Milmil Pakatu, Nutu Kuruka, Narani, Warpaka, Chaparani, Warpaka Ringani.
It's very hard to know what to say after performance. I mean, the whole thing, not just the songs, but the songs and the talk, as affecting and as entrancing as this. But now we'll come back to prose, and would people who want to ask a question, let us know.
Bryce Courtney was on the radio some time ago before he died, and he said something to whoever was interviewing him, that he was glad that he was in his 70s and he was living in Australia because he thought that Australia was going the way that South Africa is today. I think he was indicating that it was sort of becoming quietly a police state.
Like more racist.
More racist would probably be it.
It's a
Well, I can't.
proportion-wise.
Yeah, I mean, my take on life is that the battle never ends. The great Patrick Dodson said to me, the struggle never ends. The reward is the people you meet along the way. And racism is only one of the problems of the world. And South Africa, while it climbed that enormous mountain, that Everest, through Nelson Mandela, it's got a lot of problems now. And some of those problems are, have different names, but they are huge problems. So to get into weighing up Australia v South Africa, I certainly wouldn't be in a position to do that. I really respect what the South African people attempted, and I sincerely wish them all the best on that journey. But they're not home, just as we're not home.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can only add to that by saying that I think Bertrand Russell said something about, we're all victims to our own prejudices, and some people would rather die than apply reason. And often that's got to do, when you look closely at isms, I'd have to say that at the back of it all is inevitably some very human foible like ego, power, greed. It's usually the same old culprits that keep popping up, and it can be masked as religion or race or whatever, but inevitably there are vested interests in the background who stand to gain. I don't know about... Look, Australia's got major issues here with race, and it's ironic for such a migrant country to... but I think our biggest friction, like we were saying before, our biggest friction is our unresolved relationship with our First Nations people. And we have to commit ourselves to that task. We have to... there's so much confusion. I could speak to that all night in a way. It's weird being someone, if you get right down to it, it's weird being someone of Irish descent living under a flag that has a Union Jack in the corner, that's the flag of your oppressor, that caused the famine, was responsible in so many ways for 800 years of colonisation in Ireland, that leads to my people being sent here to Australia. There's all sorts of complications in this country that we haven't dealt with. The simple solution is to be a republic or be an independent country. We're still not there, and part of that maturity that we have to go through now, as Canada and other nations have had to do, is try and find some semblance of independence and to really establish a proper relationship with our First Nations people via a treaty or declare war and say it's war. I mean, do something. Otherwise we just sit in the nothing. We sit in this nothing, this limbo, and go, let's pretend nothing happened. It's what teenagers might do. Yeah, we have to mature now and really solve those problems in an adult way.
I'd just like to add something to that. I've just come back from the Sydney Writers' Festival, and I did a session up there with Stan Grant, and I think he's a really important voice in Australia now in terms of Aboriginal voices which impact into mainstream Australia. I think the last three really significant figures are Patrick Dodson, Noel Pearson and now Stan Grant. And there's many reasons why I think Stan Grant's very important. Like, he's ferociously well read. He's He is extremely articulate. It all happened for him with the Adam Goods thing, and his views on that need to be read to be understood, because that was both a very simple issue and a very complex issue. And he stated the simple issue with great emotional clarity, but he was the first person who shone the light onto the complex issues to do with Aboriginal identity that the whole Goods thing raised. But the other thing that is really important about Stan Grant for me is that we are part of a national drama, but we are part of a universal drama. We're part of an international drama. And what Shane was saying before about behind all the isms, you see the old Shakespearean motives surfacing. The thing about Stan Grant was he left Australia for 16 years. He reported on the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. He went into squares just after buses exploded. He's dealt with the Mujahideen. He's dealt with the Taliban. He's reported on Northern Ireland. And so what that gives him is an international perspective on Australia. And I think that is a major step forward, because it's no good Australians feeling like they've got this unique problem that's unsolvable. It may not be identically replicated around the world, but it is very similar. I met Malcolm Fraser, actually introduced me to the chief of the Canadian Indigenous people. They have a council of chiefs, and this guy was the head, Phil Fontaine. And he listed the problems of Indigenous people in Canada, and they're the same as the Indigenous problems of Indigenous people here. So we're talking about a global drama, and that's what I think Stan Grant will bring to that debate. He's an Indigenous person talking on Indigenous issues with a genuinely global perspective.
Hi, thanks for this evening. You're both national treasures. You both told stories there of your first contact, if you can call it that, with Aboriginal people, where that became very present for you, and they both involved conflict and you being, some form of violence. That could have gone any other way for you that day. What is it that separates when we're faced with a conflict, whether we hit back or run, or whether it shapes our life? And look at not career, I don't mean careers as in the money you've made out of it, but your careers have been built on writing, thinking about and engaging with this. What is that?
Well, for me, I'd need a team of psychiatrists to get to the bottom of that. Where would you find them? I've always found songwriting cheaper than therapy, but there's a whole background to that, and look, I'm going to write a book. Marty keeps on my back about writing. I've got to write these stories down. We put things in a nutshell there, but there's these beautiful experiences with my mother on the street talking to Aboriginal women. There's a 3-year-old, 4-year-old kid looking up at her, knowing she is totally at ease with these women. And she's known them since she was a young woman, because they were friends of her mother's. And when I said to her, how would your mum have known them? And she said, probably through her mother. And, in a way, you're just part of a continuum. I thought I found something, and it's very interesting. When you go back and look through the records, when Framingham Mission's getting carved up, or when the Lake Condah Reserve is getting carved up, or when the Aboriginal soldiers come back from the First World War and are not given access at Lake Condah to soldier settlement blocks and discriminated against. Forgive my phraseology, but the white fellas are there as well, writing to the paper saying this is outrageous. It's the same with any history you look at. It's complicated, yeah? It's complex. There isn't us and them, there's none of that. Our stories, Aboriginal and non-Indigenous, are already intertwined in this country. It's not like, as Marty says, it's within his family now, it's within my family, it's You know, I was called on it in Ireland, you know, like at 4 o'clock in the morning in the middle of Sean Aruta's study, you know. How far do your feet go down? I said, pardon? He said, how far do your feet go down in this country? And I knew my ancestors' feet went down there, but I went, my feet go down in Australia, you know, and I knew this was the country of my belonging. Manning Clark turned me on early in my life to the notion of spirit of place, genius loci, that inevitably the land, the culture, the climate, everything will determine who we become as Australians. And so why not go with the guides who've got a 60,000 year head start to get your bearings? It's just common sense, really. Push on through the hard bits. And I think as an artist, that's where the rewards are too. I mean, without being stupid or foolish, but to press on through the hard bits is really, I think, where you find that's how the light gets in, yeah, where the cracks are, yeah.
Well, I sort of would say a similar thing. For me, I pushed on out of need because I grew up in a place where there was this silence. No one spoke about anything which struck me as going to the essence of life, and that was why sport mattered also. Because first time when I got out on the sports field, you saw all these people who were larger than life. Like some of them were funny, and some of them were comic, and some of them were graceful, and I saw beauty, and that's why it was the most interesting place to be. But I just knew there was a whole other dimension to life that I just did not have access to, and it was stifling me, and you know, it was painful, and I wanted the whole shebang. I wanted to have as much life as I could, and to engage with my country in the largest way that I could, because that's what, you know, as Shane is saying, there are risks in it, and there are some pretty poor moments in it, but by gee, there's some good moments in it. And during the 90s when Howard was in government, and anyone who had relationships with Aboriginal people was being written off as being motivated by guilt. But I never was, because the really important Aboriginal people I met never asked it of me. And what my engagement with Aboriginal Australia deepened my love for Australia. I really love my country. And so that's why I did it, ultimately because I got benefits from it. Yeah, just before we go, I just want to tell one story about Shane. One night, I'm staying at his place, and we're coming home late.
Is it permissible?
And it was I don't know what sort of car it was you had, but it was a little car. It was just a little. And he lives in Killarney up this back lane, and we're just heading into the back lane, and this guy jumps out into the headlights, and he's a really wild-looking man. And he stands in front, and Shane stops, and we get out. And he's driving a Land Rover, and he's tried to do a three-point turn, and he's gone into a ditch. And the car's like that. It's like that. And he's got this idea that we can pull him out in this little car that Shane had. I wish I knew what it was, but it was about from here to here, this little car of his. So Shane, who's actually quite practical, says, I've got a rope at home. We'll go home and get the rope. So we go back to Shane's place, and we have a drink, and we have a smoke, and then Shane says to me, well, if we're going to be murdered, we might as well be murdered together. And so we go back, and Shane ties the rope on his little car to this Jeep Land Rover, and the guy's got the idea that he and I will be behind the car and lift it. Well, I don't know what a Land Rover weighs, but it's a lot. While this little car of Shane's will pull it out from the front. So of course it doesn't work, and just I'm up the back with this bloke. I can't believe how hard he's trying, and in the end, even he gives up, and he comes back out and he stands there and he says, it doesn't matter to me. that we can't get the car out. He says, "You don't know what you've done for me. I never believed you'd come back." Yeah. That's Shane Howard.
We've been on since last night, and every session has been good, I thought, but good in very different ways from this one. Everything was propositional up to now. That is, somebody said something, so yeah, I think that's right, or not. And this is not, this evening, at least for me, has not been propositional, though there were some clever propositions. It's been an experience at several levels, spiritual level. For me, and I shouldn't be autobiographical to a bunch of strangers, I've lived in Australia all my life. I was born here, but to refugee parents from Europe, and their world is a central part. And I think of myself, I am Australian, and many of the issues you've talked about, I've tried to write about. I never realised until tonight that I'm only partly Australian. There are levels and depths of Australianness, a couple of which I experienced. I can't say I learnt as proposition, but I saw people who are, not in the Australian sense, rooted in this country. And it's a very handsome thing to watch, and thank you.